Welcome to the Wisconsin Podcast. I'm Craig Sauer. Today's show focuses on autonomous vehicles and their immediate and long-term future here in Wisconsin. I recently dropped by the UW-Madison campus to speak with Jon Riehl and Peter Rafferty of the Wisconsin Automated Vehicle Proving Grounds. Designated by the U.S. Department of Transportation earlier this year, the Proving Grounds will allow researchers to test the emerging technology on closed and public Wisconsin roads. In addition to talking about what they hope to accomplish with the Proving Grounds, Riehl and Rafferty discuss how they see the technology progressing and the impacts it could have on society in the long term. Well, first of all, maybe I'll have you guys introduce yourselves. Tell me who you are and how you came to this project.
Well, my name is, hello, everybody. I'm Peter Rafferty with UW-Madison. We're here in the College of Engineering and more specifically with the Traffic Operations and Safety Lab, or TOPS Lab. And the work here in the university and the college has focused a lot on transportation technologies. And more recently, it's really gotten a lot into connected vehicles talking to each other. And then even more recently, all the advances from the automotive companies on automation and robotics and autonomous vehicles has really started to intersect more and more with public agencies and universities like ours. And with all of this interest and activity going on, to make a longer story short, the US DOT in 2016 had a solicitation out to have groups join a virtual network of automated vehicle proving grounds, and we applied for that and were awarded that in January.
Yeah, and hello everyone. My name is Jon Riehl. I work with Peter here in the TOPS Lab, and just to add to what Peter mentioned, we had done a Smart Cities initiative with the City of Madison back in the beginning of 2016 that it was much broader than the connected automated vehicle focus that we're looking at here with the AV Proving Grounds, but it led to a lot of the same types of projects and really kind of catalyzed a lot of the work that we're doing now.
And you mentioned that there's other proving grounds around the country. How many are there? And why do you think? Why was UW kind of chosen as an option?
There were 10 selected as part of this group, and they really they offer a wide range of facility types. Some are solely closed tracks where the automotive testing goes on. Others are more highway focused. And there are other proving grounds and testing and development going on outside of this group of 10 as well. But again, the point was in part to share some best practices and safety protocols, really work with the government agencies, both state and federal, on helping to guide policy and asking the right questions of these automakers. The UW team, I think, was selected in part because of the wide range of facilities that we offer. We're a northern climate as well, so we have snow, but we do on our team have a closed 400-acre private test track. It's a private corporation, MGA Research, with their facility down by Burlington, Wisconsin. And they've been doing that for decades there, 30 years or so. And then we also offer simulated environments here in the College of Engineering, and that's an increasingly important part of validating automated vehicle technologies. And our own campus, UW-Madison, as well as private corporate campuses, such as what American Family Insurance may offer. And then from there, as things progress in terms of technology and ability to interact, you can move to public roads, both here in the city. The City of Madison is a great partner with this, and then eventually onto on all roads.
How do you work with businesses and companies that are trying to use this technology? How are you working with auto manufacturers? Kind of what's the relationship with the business side?
Yeah, it's another great question. So I should make sure everybody knows that this designation itself doesn't come with any funding. So there's no federal funding, and this state funding is forthcoming, I like to say. So we really are focused on the private sector and industry interest here for doing the sorts of testing and research and evaluation that we're pursuing. So both here and at other proving grounds, traditional automakers may be involved, GM, Ford, Toyota, and those for their own development. And then there's all the bigger technology companies like Waymo, which is the Google self-driving unit is now they're called Waymo under the Alphabet brand. And then there's Tesla. So there's a whole variety of the more traditional automakers and those larger companies like Waymo. But then so much of our interest here at the UW-Madison's Proving Grounds tends to focus more on the wide variety of what I call edge cases for automated vehicle testing. Apart from just the vehicle technologies and the sensors and the algorithms or things like that you might be testing on a closed track, we are thinking about cybersecurity, privacy issues, interaction with bicycles and pedestrians. Motorcycles are a big thing here. Harley Davidson, for instance, and other advocacy groups here in Wisconsin are very good to work with on how are these things really going to work with these other types of road users. And then I mentioned snow. We have a lot of deer. So when automakers say we're going to have a driverless vehicle available for you to buy by 2020, that's partly true. That may be true, and it may work well on a very clear highway environment with very good pavement marking and not a lot of traffic. That's sort of how the Tesla partial automation works these days. But anytime you vary from that in terms of a work zone or how it does respond to the wildlife, or when the snow falls and the pavement markings are obscured, or when the snow even obscures the sensors on the vehicle or the road signs or the signal. All of these different edge cases need to be addressed. And well, there's an incredible amount of progress that's being made already. There's a whole lot more that has to be worked out yet for these things to really proliferate.
Yeah, I think to add to that a few different things, without getting too much into the technical details on this, there's the Society of Automotive Engineers, SAE, has released a list of 6 different levels of automation. The key thing here is that level 0 and 1 vehicles are kind of what's on the road today. They don't have, 0 would be no automation, 1 would be driver assistance systems, something like your cruise control or even lane departure warning, some of the newer systems that are out there. Partial automation, level 2 would be something like the Tesla's autopilot. Once you get into levels 3 through 5, that's really when you start talking about these automated vehicles where you can pay less and less attention and the vehicle will do it for you. So really, what Peter was mentioning is level 4 high automation, where you can use a vehicle on a lot of different scenarios and it will drive for you without you paying attention. That'll be here much sooner than level 5. I was at a presentation, I was presenting on this actually in Minnesota last week, and someone else on my panel put it pretty well. He said that 95% of this is easy, and I wouldn't say easy, but relatively easy. It's the 5%, those edge cases Peter was mentioning, where this is going to be really difficult, and it's going to be a much longer period. So you think about when you're driving on the road, some of the different cases, like Peter mentioned, a deer comes out, construction zone. What if you have multiple different things happen at once? That's something that we, process as we drive. And sometimes we make mistakes and we crash, but a lot of times we figure it out. And these vehicles are going to need to figure out all these situations to get to what's called level 5, where they can drive for you. There doesn't even need to be a steering wheel in the vehicle. So I think that testing that we're really focusing on is how to get these vehicles from that 4 to 5, that 5%, some of the situations Peter mentioned, and validating, sort of like they validate for crash testing nowadays for vehicles. You'd be validating, not necessarily looking at the exact technology that's written by the manufacturers or performed by them, but you put them out on the road on our test tracks and see how they function. If they pass the test, then they're certified or something like that. So that's some of the stuff we've been working on.
So kind of mentioned kind of the various levels of automation. I'm just kind of curious, from the public's point of view, how far along are we with this technology and how soon can we expect it to be actually in our kind of everyday lives?
There's another technical term I'll try and avoid here, but basically the systems that are currently on the vehicle. So I mentioned lane departure warning, forward collision warnings, another one that you've seen a lot on car commercials nowadays. These different systems are going to be the road to full automation. So what you're probably going to see is vehicles have more and more of these systems available. When you think about Tesla's autopilot vehicle, it's a level 2 vehicle in that if you get onto a highway and you set it on autopilot, what is it really doing with the tech? It's got a couple different technologies it's working with. So it's got lane departure warning, so it'll lane follow. And then it has a kind of variable cruise control in the sense that it will figure out the speed of the car in front of you, and it'll moderate its speed based on that. So with a few different systems in normal scenarios, if it's clear day, no unexpected events, construction or anything on the roadway, the road's well designed with nice markings and everything else, you can actually get onto a freeway, for instance, turn this on and then turn it off before you exit the freeway. So that's here now, and it's getting better. And the way I see it is that these systems, you'll continue to see more and more of these subsystems applied to vehicles that'll take more and more of the control away. So you're talking, when I mentioned the level 4 high automation vehicle, so in most scenarios you can turn this on, especially getting on a freeway is going to be one of the first ones, and doing that. I've heard from the different chip makers like Intel, for instance, think that the slower speeds actually are the next easiest, and it's really that mid-range that they're going to get to last. And it's really these different little technologies, the pieces that are going to add together to get you there. So a full level 5 automation vehicle on the road, there's anyone's guess. That some people say 2025, 2030. I think we've considered maybe 2040 is probably more likely to see the first truly level 5 vehicles on the road. And then there's, of course, the time to turn over fleets. So, I have a vehicle, it's a 1999, right? So, and I don't plan on getting a new vehicle until it dies. So, and there are a lot of people like me out there who are going to hold on to vehicles. So that fleet turnover is going to take some time.
I think everybody's assuming this is going to be the standard vehicle at some point. Is it a generation away from becoming you'll no longer have vehicles that you can drive on the road except for maybe collector's items? How far along are we to that point?
Yeah, that's another good question. This whole transition is a whole good area of discussion on trying to predict how this is all going to unfold. Like John said, you have level 2 automation out there right now. The vehicles that are coming, new vehicles now, are just replete with all this level 1 driver assistance automation for sure. Level 3 is coming from some automakers. Some are skipping that and going to level 4. Again, I don't want to bore people with the different levels of automation too much, but it is important to keep in mind because it really matters not only what level of automation you're talking about, but when and where that vehicle can operate. And that's a big part of that transition that we're talking about. The places where we're going to see the transition first are in urban areas where shared mobility is a big thing from providers like Uber and Lyft and others that are doing this sort of thing. They're also doing increasingly electric vehicles. So you have this confluence of vehicles that are shared, electric, connected, and automated, all happening together, but really in urban areas where that makes the most sense. Much longer will be in rural areas or for certain types of goods movement where the transition may be more than decades. We'll just have to see. A lot of different counterbalancing trends going on here. The fear that we hear from people is that they will somehow be restricted in being able to drive their own vehicle. John is one of them. I just want to allay that's a long ways off before anybody's really seriously thinking about that. I think the first place we might see some restrictions are in maybe in certain city centers where a vehicle has to be part of a fleet that's monitored and automated to operate in that environment. But when and where that's going to happen, it's anybody's guess.
The other one probably is on highways. You'll probably see autonomous vehicle lanes, something like you see HOV lanes, the high occupancy vehicle lanes currently. You'll probably see those types of lanes. Now, the difference will be HOV lanes typically are around cities, but these AV lanes will probably go regionally, so that one of the big areas is truck platooning. You might see that sooner than later. And then, probably down the road, we said like 2040 or so, and it's anyone's guess, but eventually, if you have one of these AVs, you can get in this lane and use it. If you don't, there'll still be other lanes for you. And actually, that's one area that we've talked about too, which Peter calls the messy middle, where it's actually a harder problem to solve. If we could, as soon as this technology, level 5, is available, if we could just immediately change over the fleet, then that would be a much easier problem to solve than having these vehicles interact with vehicles that are still manually driven at various levels of automation. So do they have lane departure warning? Is it someone like me who's going to hang out of my car? Is it a classic car owner? Is it a motorcycle? And some of those, like you mentioned, will exist on the roads with historic licenses. If you think about the horse and buggy today, you still see in various communities, especially even across Wisconsin, there are these vehicles on the road, and they've adapted somewhat, right? They have, some of them have lights, some of them at least have reflectors, but roads even are still designed somewhat for them in the sense where there's a lot of horse and buggy traffic. Maybe the shoulders are wider, things like that. So in rural areas, you'll definitely still have classic car owners and motorcycles for as long as, I can imagine.
This really is a generational change. There's just a lot yet to happen. The closest corollary I think we have is the transition 100 years ago from a horse-centric mobility to the automobile. Really, there just hasn't been anything this transformative in personal mobility since then.
We had to take a technical break during the recording of the interview, and I thought it was a good time to take a break from the show here as well. If you're new to the podcast, make sure to check out some of our recent shows about sandhill cranes, chronicling the stories of veterans, and hiking the Ice Age Trail. All those episodes and more are available at wispod.com and on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play. All right, now back to the show. There's been a lot of fear out there in the public, just posting on social media, like concern about it, comfortability about it. Are you guys going to be comfortable jumping into these vehicles? And over time, how do you see that transitioning for people?
To answer your first question, I would definitely be comfortable getting into one of these. And I'm a shared mobility user already, and as these are increasingly automated, I won't hesitate to take those. In answer to some of these concerns, again, this isn't a switch that's going to happen in 2020. This is going to be a longer transition to that. There will be the mix of automated and manual or conventional vehicles out in the environment. But generally, these automated technologies really are available. They're out there right now in all these new vehicles in the form of the advanced driver assist systems, ADAS, like the lane keeping and the emergency braking, the self parking, and those types of things. And as people get increasingly used to that sort of thing, it's less of a jump to go to that next step. For instance, folks are comfortable with cruise control these days, so going from there to an adaptive cruise control where the vehicle is responding to whatever vehicle's in front of it and adapting its speed and to match that or maintain a safe following distance is just an example of one of those incremental steps. There may be some tricky things in terms of what is the expectation between the system and the driver at those mid-levels of automation, where if something goes awry, the driver might have to take over control. But generally, automated vehicles with all the sensors are way more aware of their environment than a human would ever be. They're not going to fall asleep. They're not going to be drunk or distracted. They're just so much safer. Now that's not I don't mean that as a blanket statement that there aren't things still to work out in terms of how they're interacting with pedestrians or bicycles and motorcycles or other unexpected things. These are all things that we're still working on. But this transition, I'm very optimistic about that transition and people's comfort with it as they hear more about it and they're just experiencing it more. Big part of our or a part of our work anyway is making sure that these things are available for demonstration and for people to take a look at. The October 19th, we had 5 vehicles parked out in front of engineering right here on campus that had different levels of automated technologies and sensor technologies on them so people could see what that looks like. That's the sort of thing that is going to be helpful just for people to be increasingly comfortable with this.
And John, would you be comfortable getting in one of these?
Yeah, so to answer the question, sure, today I would do it right away. But again, I'm a risk taker, so I wouldn't put too much weight on that in the sense that that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to function well today. But I mean, really the bottom line is that automated vehicles or autonomous vehicles, fully autonomous vehicles are the future. They are coming. So, you have a couple different ways to look at it. You can try and resist that as much as possible for as long as possible, but they will be here, by say 2075, 2100, these vehicles will be the norm. So our approach here at the AV Proving Grounds is to be both optimistic and looking towards that future, but realizing that you need to have some skepticism and understand that these aren't going to be perfect right away. You're going to see crashes that are going to bring up huge news stories and questions of whether or not this is going to be something that is worth pursuing and all sorts of stuff. So I think with the Proving Grounds, we're really there to test and make sure these vehicles are safe. They do provide for better enhanced mobility for more people and more situations. They're more environmentally sustainable, and really just that the planning of our even city planning, regional planning goes well. I mean, you think about urban sprawl and in my mind, how terribly that went, in a lot of people's mind, maybe not the same. But again, in my mind, I'll just say this, I'll probably take some people off, but I think it was poor planning back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, not realizing what the vehicle was going to do to development patterns. And now I think we have that as an example. So, for instance, our Madison MPO, Metropolitan Planning Organization, is looking at autonomous vehicles as the future and how do you plan differently for these things. The city of Madison even is developing a parking structure in the east side, near east side, where there's a lot of development going on now. And that parking structure is already able, they're making it such that it'll be able to be transitioned into other space when maybe parking isn't necessarily required. So I guess the short answer is, you should have some skepticism, but if you look at it, there's also the generational divide in the sense that when you look at all these results you were talking about on different polls and whatnot, many studies have been done showing that younger and younger generations are more accepting of this. So you think about kids born in 2005, for instance, they don't know a world without smartphones where they can look up any piece of information when they need it, wherever they are. That's a very different model than even someone like me who was still born after color television and analog brakes on the vehicle I expected to have when I was driving. I had computers my entire life and things like that. It's still a much different group of people who have that expectation. So you think about these generations who are going to be born even today or maybe 10, 20 years from now, who are going to see only automated vehicles or mostly automated vehicles. They're going to be so accepting of it that that's not going to be really an issue anymore. You're going to have people, I might be alive, hopefully in 2075, I'll be really, really old, and I'll probably be that old curmudgeon guy who's sitting there saying, I'm going to drive my own vehicle no matter what. And then I'll realize, oh shoot, I have no mobility anymore. Maybe I'll have this thing come pick me up so I can actually get to the hospital and do whatever I need. So I think that's just something to consider.
Have you guys read any history on the transition from horse to car? And is there any examples or past examples that you can look at and kind of understand human psychology of where how it's gonna work as this transition from manual driving to autonomous driving takes place?
Yes, people are looking back at that quite a lot. And in that case, two things. One is that it took people, it was a generational shift to learn how to drive. And when you're taking these corners, why does my car tip over? This is something that we, just had to learn as we went. And then on the policy development and the land use and planning sides, That's a really big thing. And there's some other examples on the regulatory side, like from the steamship type policies. But without getting into that, the transformation that's happening now is going to have these implications on land use and parking provision, like John just mentioned. And there are lessons from 100 years ago that we can learn from, and hopefully think about more proactively.
Yeah, and to add to that, I mean, think about what the transition from the horse and buggy to the car did. Really, mainly it was speed, and also your horse doesn't get tired. I mean, yeah, your car gets. The car doesn't get tired like the horse does. The car, sure, it needs gas. It's going to have maintenance issues. But if you want to drive from Chicago to Minneapolis, you can do that in a day, and that's not unheard of. A lot of people do that. Whereas the horse and buggy trek was a little bit longer. So what that did for people is it enhanced their mobility. And then ultimately, as Peter mentioned, it didn't necessarily enhance their safety right away. There were a lot of problems with that. But ultimately, it did enhance the safety as well. And to the point where now we take that for granted. And actually, you could argue that a lot of people would even just fly from Chicago to Minneapolis now. And there was that transition, and that was a big one too. But you think about what this transition could do for people, sort of in that similar vein. Well, there's going to be more people now that can get on the road and get in these vehicles. So, for instance, one of the big, I think, PR moves by one of the car companies was they had a blind driver in their vehicle. So you've got a whole nother group of people who can drive. There's questions of, you could put kids in the vehicle on their own, and there's questions of, what age should they be, and all those sorts of questions. But theoretically, you could put your pet in the vehicle, send them to the vet, all sorts of stuff that we haven't thought about, and especially elder care and mobility. That's one we've been focusing a lot on. Rural areas, even in Dane County and the surrounding counties in Madison, getting people to and from the hospitals is a huge problem, especially with the younger generations of people moving away and their parents aging in place. What do? Well, sometimes they have to move. But in that future, with automated vehicles, you could age in place because that vehicle could come and pick you up at any time and take you wherever you need to. So I think you look at the transition, from horse and buggy to car, and you say, well, what were the changes there and how did we deal with those? And that's the transportation history part of this that Peter was mentioning. And then you project that onto what could be the future here. And there's multiple different futures. There's, again, at the presentations I was at last week in Minnesota, there were a couple different groups looking at scenario planning. One scenario being the far end of the spectrum that these never take hold, which they claimed was very, very unlikely, up to the spectrum of these come on board a lot sooner than we think, and we don't do any planning for them. And then anything in between. So I think there's that ability to look back and say what happened and what can we do to make sure that this is a good future.
I guess I'm really curious about. There's a lot of mental exercise you can play, and like how will this affect society in general? Obviously, we're talking about urban planning and and if you build a building right now, you're building with the car in mind. You got to build the road and the parking lot and whatever. What are some other ways you see this affecting society in the large scale view of it?
Yeah, it's a great question. You're right about it being just a thought exercise largely, and there are different camps and different folks speculating on a variety of different implications from this. John had mentioned sprawl earlier, and with the increasing automation making the driving task less expensive in personal economic terms, that may encourage additional sprawl from certain populations that will move farther away from where they're commuting, for instance, because their vehicle is driving and they can use that time to do other things. So that may be something we'll see in sort of midterm, I think. On the other hand, as vehicle ownership continues to decline and shared mobility fleets continue to proliferate, I see a total number of vehicles out there decreasing. But so that may in some way reduce vehicle miles traveled, total consumption of our transportation network. But at the Same time, those vehicles that are out there are going to be in service a lot more, driving different people, not necessarily just their owners here and there. So that's another one of these counterbalancing effects that we're seeing, and how that plays out and when that plays out, it's a very difficult thing to see or to speculate on.
Yeah, and thinking about what can we do now as far as the city planning goes, right? The city can decide to do a lot of different things with their roads. So Madison decided years ago to make State Street only accessible to certain vehicles, right? So you can't drive your personal car on there. Delivery vehicles can go on there, buses, bicycles, for instance. And it's a lot different environment now than back in, say, the 70s when that wasn't the case. And that was something that Madison decided to do. And you can tell when you walk down State Street that that's different. Especially next time you do that, think about it, and you'll really be able to quickly tell the difference and spot those things. So the city could decide to do any number of things. You think about the City of London in the UK has a congestion pricing charge to drive in their downtown. And actually that affected me. I was on vacation over there earlier this year, and I decided, so we had rented a car to drive around the countryside, and I decided to actually park that vehicle outside of the congestion pricing zone and take the tube in versus driving in and paying for that. Might I have done that otherwise? Maybe, but definitely because of that. So you think about congestion pricing model and how that affects things. Cities in the U.S. have been more hesitant to do that, but there is certainly talk of that from different cities. So what if you have these automated vehicle only zones? And that could be something a city decides to do, right? And they could decide to do that, and they're going to have a lot different development pattern downtown than they're going to have if they don't do that. And that's a decision that can be made now, or thought about now, at least, to be made in the future. You look at the cities over in the UK, for instance, and a lot of them are more pedestrian friendly. And a lot of that, yeah, they're older cities for sure, but it was still a design principle that they wanted to make sure the downtowns were walkable. So they closed off certain streets. They made it hard for vehicles to get through the downtown, and they made it easier for them at the same time to go around. And we do that in some cities in the country as well, but it is a marked difference if you're traveling over there versus anywhere in the U.S. And that's a mentality of what you want to do. So it's the same thing here with autonomous vehicles. How do you want to see these play out? I think shared mobility is going to be huge. You look at younger generations are moving to cities. They want to live downtown, be around things. It's not everyone, but there is the trend that a lot of them do. If that trend continues, there's a lot of people getting rid of cars and maybe taking only Uber. That's a thing a lot of people in Madison actually do already. So if that Uber's autonomous, well, then that's something they'll probably be likely to do. So, yeah, those thought scenarios, it's important now to think of those, or else, like I said, in 20, 30 years, we're going to have what we're going to have. So better to think of it now than to just hope for the best later.
Another concern I hear voiced from time to time is that you will have so many individuals buying cars that have high automation that will, like I said, maybe contributes to them living further away from their work, contributing to sprawl, additional traffic, and then the vehicle can drop the person off at their work, and then it can just, there's not a parking spot right there, it can drive around or drive out of town to find its own parking spot. And there's this vision of having all of these robot cars just driving around empty while their owners are doing something else. Who knows? Personally, I don't see it playing out that way. And then the concern with, well, if you have all these extra robot cars going around, what does that mean for bikes and pedestrians and pollution and energy consumption, all these other implications? But as John was saying, there are a lot of policy options that urban areas can do. And I just don't envision I just don't envision a future like that playing out quite like that fear. But maybe I hope I'm right.
I think another one of the fears, as I've heard, is that these vehicles will be so expensive that it'll price low-income people out of the market a little bit. I'm just kind of curious what your reflections on that is. And also, I mean, I think there's an assumption that with this technology, there will be less people buying cars. There'll be more shared consumption. What are your kind of thoughts on how much this is going to cost to consumers?
So sadly, you're probably right from the beginning. These vehicles are going to be very expensive. You look at the Tesla vehicles now. I know Musk is coming out with the Model 3 and it's cheaper, but it's still not cheap. And those vehicles don't even have full automation, right? So yeah, they're going to be expensive at first, but think about the computer at first. The computer was something expensive at first. Only large companies bought computers. They took up rooms at first, and then they got smaller. But even when they got smaller, you had to be a company to buy it or someone who had the means to do so. But nowadays, so many people have computers at their fingertips, smartphones or some other computer devices. Many of them are relatively inexpensive. Obviously, they're still, not free, but they're pretty well distributed. I think that might happen the same with these vehicles. Like Peter mentioned, as the technologies get the economies of scale, they're selling more, they can make them cheaper and everything else. They're competing, so the price has to, if I'm going to sell my Ford vehicle versus the GM vehicle, I'm going to have to compete a bit on that. So I think it will ultimately come down. There will be that time period, though, where certainly the people that have these things are the more well off. So one of the things we're looking at with our proving grounds, for instance, is a potential first mile, last mile transit vehicle. So what I mean by that is it supplements the current transit system, and it can go into neighborhoods that right now the city, the cost benefit doesn't work itself out to go into that neighborhood with a bus. But if you have a smaller shuttle that can be dynamically routed, which these types of algorithms are being developed now, so it can figure out it needs to pick up 5 people and maybe a 6th person even on its route request to be picked up, and it can dynamically decide whether or not that makes sense, pick those people up and get them to the bus stop. So, we're looking at things like that to bring automation maybe to another group that won't have access right away. But I think eventually, like I said, 2100, you'll probably see the prices are down to car ownership is available today to a certain group of people. But you also need to remember, car ownership today is not available to a certain group of people. And I hope that if we do this correctly, this even automation will help people in a broader spectrum than the car does even today.
Anything else you guys wanted to add that we didn't cover?
Sure. There's a couple things I'd like to add. One, I know, and this is actually an industry that is one of the largest in a lot of different states, is the not necessarily just trucking, but delivery and livery services in general. And there's a huge question from truckers: am I going to lose my job? And I would say, if you're a truck driver and you're at least 35, 40 now, you're probably not going to see too much change. There might be certain platoons where there's a single driver in 10 years and the lead of 2 other vehicles, but there's still that need. And there's already a shortage for truck drivers, for instance. So I think that will work itself out. If you're younger than that and you're getting into that, that's when you need to start thinking about, well, what's that transition going to look like? And I go back to the point that this is coming. So this isn't, because Wisconsin has this AV proving grounds, it doesn't mean Peter and I are telling all the citizens of Wisconsin, this is what you're getting, this is what we're doing, and good luck. What we're saying is we're trying to say, come to us, talk to us about what problems you're having. Particularly, we've addressed a lot of urban issues already, but we're looking at addressing rural issues too. We understand that this isn't everyone's perfect future. We just understand that it is going to ultimately be the future. So we want to work with people on, well, what are your primary concern? What do you think with these vehicles would be helpful to you or hurtful to you or anywhere in between? And how can we as a proving grounds work with you to make that better?
Sounds like a little bit of what you're doing is just kind of like public education.
Yeah, certainly with the demonstrations, having those vehicles here, helping to get the word out about what these vehicles can and cannot do, both now and in the future is a big part of that. a chief interest of ours is, how are these going to interact as mixed fleets of automated and conventional human-driven vehicles, as well as the interactions with those and pedestrians and bicycles. That's a big thing here in Madison, for sure, in scooters and motorcycles and all of these other modes, and then what happens when it snows and so on. So that's, like Jon was saying, that's really what we're here for, is to be engaged with the policymakers, the agencies, the automakers, the public, the other advocacy groups, and let's make sure that we have those concerns and questions out there so that we can keep collaborating on how best to address those.
So, you have a level 5 vehicle and the manufacturer says, oh, you don't need a steering wheel. But what about the person who, has a mile to drive on their dirt lane to get home, and it's not mapped or it's not ready for that type of level of use? Well, that vehicle is going to be useless to them. So if you advocate for that type of thing now, well, what do you have? You have the ability to plug in, and maybe it's not a traditional steering wheel, but like in an Xbox controller. So
Wow.
maybe you just, at that point, you'll have Bluetooth on your phone or something, or maybe people say, I won't have service, so I want to make sure I have a wired connection. That's the type of stuff you can do now if your voice is heard. So I would like to get out to some of the more communities around the state as part of the Wisconsin Proving Grounds and talk with folks about what some of the specifics needs would be, because I think those edge cases we're talking about, these are other additional edge cases. So you have a vehicle that can go pick up an elderly person and bring them to a hospital, but what if that vehicle can't actually go in and help that person walk to the vehicle? Well, then you still either need a person or you need some other mechanism to do that. So there's all sorts of questions, and I think there's more questions right now than there are answers. But if we're not asking these questions now, they're not going to get addressed in the future.
What was the best question that you've gotten from a member of the public about these vehicles?
Well, yeah, there have been a lot, and it's great talking to different audiences. But one that comes to mind was just 2 weeks ago, talking to a group of broadcasters, like media broadcasters, and somebody seemed to be lamenting the fact that their granddaughter wouldn't be able to pull up. This was a true story of somebody, I think more of his age, maybe a spouse or something, who in one of those 2-door classic Monte Carlos pulled up next to a cop and rolled down the window and said, "Want to race?" And lamenting the fact that in the future his granddaughter would not be able to do that in an automated vehicle. And yeah, so I mean, it's a generational change.
Because I've had people, obviously come up and say, these are never going to happen. Why are you guys doing anything with this? And by the time I've talked with them and spoken through it, usually they come around to realize, oh, okay, you're not. I think that's one thing I've seen is people not understanding what we're trying to do here. You're just trying to push all this stuff on us. That's not what we're doing. But I've seen some things like Peter's mentioned too, with just all of these, odd scenarios that people aren't going to be able to do anymore because you don't have your own.
A lot of good conversations circle around ethical questions too, about when your vehicle, if there's a malfunction, and so there's some school children that came out into the road, what does the algorithm in the vehicle decide to do? Does it veer off and risk harm to the passenger, or is it programmed to protect the passenger? And again, we don't have the answers for all of those. Though I do say that with the sensor technologies and the fail-safes in place, that sort of situation is going to be so much more rare than it is now with folks that may be manually driving and missing a situation like that and having something bad happen.
Yeah, there's 2 quick things to add to what Peter said. The one is that the decision, is it going to be a utilitarian decision? So if you're driving your own personal vehicle and it can either crash into 5 people that are crossing the road, or it can crash and kill the driver, what is it going to do? If you think about, people now are ultimately self-interested. And I'm not saying that they're heartless, but what I'm saying is that when you make that final decision, you're ultimately thinking about self-preservation. Are these vehicles going to do that? That's a good question. The other one is, this is kind of a good kind of joke about these things from a mobility standpoint. If these vehicles are going to be safe and see someone and stop for them, well, if it's driving down, say, one of the streets near the university here, And students start to realize, hey, wait a second, if I step in front of that vehicle, it's going to stop for me no matter what. So, yeah, I'm halfway between the crosswalk, but the building I need to get to is right there. Well, I could just step out right now because the vehicle will stop. And once one person realizes that, there's going to be a bunch. So what do you do in that situation? That's it.
Yeah, it's very hard to program assertiveness in driving or courtesy.
Interesting. Since I don't usually do like a 2-person interview or have 2 subjects, I wanted to try one thing here is, why don't you ask each other one question about just anything that you want to know about this technology or what the other person is thinking about this technology?
Well, John, here's maybe a wrinkly question that comes up in Madison a lot is, what are the implications for traditional taxi companies? The question about jobs comes up, and so with increasing automation, what do you think is going to happen with the traditional taxi companies, or how might you see this playing out? They've got competition already with the Lyft and Uber and things like that coming in, and so it seems like a piling on with automation.
And I'm not saying I want this to happen, but they either adapt or die, I think. And we've seen that with some of the taxi companies here in the city looking forward to this technology as an option for them. Even look at Uber right now. If they don't adapt to Uber, they can still, there's certain routes where a taxi can still, like an airport to downtown route where someone just gets out of the airport and they get in a line, that's going to be around and they don't have to change too much for that. But otherwise, I mean, they're driving around and no one's hailing them. And what do? Well, they need to develop algorithms for hailing apps, and some of them are doing that. The ones that don't will die. Same thing with this. Taxi companies, if they don't, and embrace isn't the right word. They don't even need to like it. They need to understand it's coming and think about how that's going to affect their business going forward. So that's, I could see them dying off pretty easily if they don't.
Yeah, and then related to that issue is the taxis work well for providing certain populations and off-peak trips. It's a very important service. And if you have other mobility companies, providers coming in and really siphoning off the more revenue-generating, low-hanging fruit, the airport trips and so forth, that really hurts that business model. So I'm mostly partly putting you on the spot because it's a hard question, but just acknowledging that it is something that we're grappling with.
Oh yeah, and that would be terrible for a lot of people, right? Because the Uber right now will not take some of those less revenue-generating trips overnight in areas that really need the service. Say you're a third shift worker and you're relying on that taxi. Well, the taxi company now has to charge you more because they're not making that money during the other revenue. The Uber's not going to serve you. So what do you do? So there are a lot of negatives that could come with that if we don't think about it. I guess my question for Peter is vehicles being operated by one person. I guess, do you really see shared mobility taking on, or do you see this becoming, I'm just going to get a personal vehicle that can drive me around and I don't even need to maybe own a house. I could just live in this autonomous vehicle that has a bed in the back, like tiny houses now, and I'll just be driving around all the time. So I'm going to increase vehicle. So do you really see that people are going to accept the shared future as much as we keep talking about it?
Yes, I do in urban areas. I just don't see this trend slowing down. Is everybody going to adopt it? No. But I think there's an increasing trend that we're seeing already with shared mobility. The question, and again in urban areas, the question about automated tiny houses is an intriguing one that I hadn't heard of before. But why not? Well, there are folks that live that lifestyle, and if you had an automated small RV or tiny house, then by all means, I'd like to see how that works.
Yeah, go to sleep in Chicago. The next day you wake up and wherever you want.
Obviously, this is the Proving Grounds is just getting started. It's just kind of a beginning. Looking 10 years from now, like what do you hope will have become accomplished through this effort? What are you looking forward to?
Getting these things out there, and really, again, if I didn't mention it earlier, the UW-Madison isn't a public transportation agency, and we're not the private automotive sector. So we have the ability to do the more independent evaluations to help guide policy development, prioritization of how we as a tax-paying society, really, to put it bluntly, how do we want transportation to be made available? There are a lot of problems right now with our how we tax and fund transportation. That was a big part of our budget deliberations this year in 2017, and the advent of, like I said, connected, electric, shared, automated vehicles really has an opportunity to transform a lot of that and to make things so much more efficient. And 10 years from now, I really hope 10 years from now we're going to be seeing a marked decrease in fatal crashes that are being prevented by increasing connectivity and automated safety features.
Yeah, so 10 years from now, I guess where we see this group being, there's different scenarios for that too, I'm sure. But I would like to be seen as one of the leading groups doing testing and certification of these vehicles. I think we've got it set up pretty well to do that. So Peter talked about our environments before. So you start with the simulation environment. So talking about those 5% of situations that are really difficult to solve, you could go out there on the road and solve them with, like, Google's driven 1 million miles with their vehicles, right? Well, million's great, but you're not going to get into every situation after 1 million. You might need to do 10, 100 million, 1 billion miles, and you're not going to do that going out on the road. So with the simulation environment, you can do that initially and get those scenarios tested so that those algorithms can get integrated into vehicles. So that's kind of one end of what we're looking at is helping on that end. Past the simulation environment, it's actually getting vehicles on our closed courses, doing some testing. Like I said, certification would be something we're really interested in doing to make sure that these vehicles are safe and are helping lead towards fewer crashes. And then hopefully, obviously 10 years is a long time, so we'll probably have at least a few different situations set up. We have a few corridors we're looking at now. There's a Madison combined autonomous and connected corridor that we're working on to test these low-speed shuttle vehicles as well as connected vehicle technology. So that corridor would be operational, and it'd be able to be used by auto manufacturers for the connected end if they want to drive on a city street and test their operations. Then having corridors on the highway. So I think in 10 years, I think it's very possible we could have an autonomous vehicle lane going from here to Chicago, for instance. There's currently a project widening I-3990 down to the border north of Rockford, and the road's already been improved from there to Chicago. So there's talk of, well, if we have an AV lane, we could be doing platooning, truck platooning, and AV testing. I think in 10 years, it's likely that could be the case. So hopefully, in 10 years, our facilities are useful. We have a wide variety that give you that ability to test the vehicle from simulating this problem that you're having that you can't solve all the way up through testing your vehicle on an open public facility.
Definitely an interesting topic and conversation. Autonomous vehicles certainly seem to be coming, and I hope we as a society design the future that we want with this technology versus being reactive to it. I'll post some links to more information about the Wisconsin Proving Grounds on the website at wispod.com. Please subscribe to the show on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play. Cheers.